Part 1. A Disguised Visit. The morning sunlight glinted off the polished glass facade of the exclusive Chambers shopping center, casting a glow that seemed to highlight its status as the city's premier destination for luxury shopping. Inside, high-end boutiques, jewelry stores, and gourmet cafes buzzed with activity as well-dressed patrons strolled through the marble-tiled halls. Yet, as Elliot Chambers stepped through the grand entrance, no one spared him a second glance. Dressed in a faded plaid shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and a red MAGA hat snug on his head, Elliot was nearly unrecognizable. This was precisely the point. As the owner of the shopping center, Elliot had spent years building his empire from the ground up, cultivating it into a symbol of exclusivity and elegance. But lately, he'd grown uneasy. Whispers of poor customer service and arrogance among his staff had reached him through anonymous complaints and dissatisfied vendors. Elliot, being a man of action, decided the best way to see the truth was to step into the shoes of an average customer. "Blend in," he muttered under his breath as he adjusted the hat. It was a controversial choice, he knew, but that was the point. He wanted to see how his employees treated someone they might view as an outsider, a test of their character when they thought no one important was watching. Elliot made his way through the center's pristine halls, noting the small details he hadn't paid attention to before. The subtle background music, the faint scent of lavender in the air, the gleaming store windows, all crafted to create an atmosphere of sophistication. Yet, as he walked, he couldn't help but notice the sidelong glances his hat and outfit drew from other shoppers. Some whispered to their companions, others simply looked away. He shrugged it off. Today wasn't about the opinions of strangers. It was about his employees. His first stop was a high-end clothing boutique that had been a cornerstone of the shopping center since its opening. The boutique's window display featured an elegant suit, hand-tailored, sleek, and undoubtedly expensive. Elliot pushed open the glass door, the chimes signaling his arrival. Inside, the air was cool and perfumed, and racks of meticulously arranged clothing lined the walls. Behind the counter stood Monica, the store's lead sales associate. She was mid-conversation with a customer, but glanced up as Elliot entered. Her eyes lingered on his hat and clothes, and her expression shifted subtly, a flicker of disdain before her professional mask slid back into place. Elliot caught it instantly. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but warm. "I was hoping to take a closer look at the suit in the window." Monica didn't move from her spot. Instead, she gave him a tight smile, the kind reserved for people she didn't expect to spend money. "That's one of our premium items," she said, her tone clipped. "It's part of our exclusive collection." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "That's why I'd like to see it." Monica hesitated, then finally stepped around the counter. She walked toward the window display with deliberate slowness, as if every step was an effort. When she returned with the suit, she didn't bother to hide the skepticism in her eyes. "This is one of our finest pieces," she said, holding the suit up for him to inspect. "It's made from Italian wool, hand-stitched, and retails for $5,000. Elliot reached out to feel the fabric, but Monica pulled it back slightly, just enough to make the gesture noticeable. "Are you sure you want to handle it?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's very delicate." He paused, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm sure." Monica reluctantly handed him the suit, her fingers brushing against his as though the contact itself was unpleasant. Elliot studied the garment carefully, running his hand over the fine stitching. "It's excellent craftsmanship," he said, genuinely impressed. "Do you have it in my size?" Monica let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "We don't carry every size in stock," she said dismissively. "And honestly, this suit might not be the best fit for you. It's designed for a different kind of clientele." The implication was clear, and Elliot felt his jaw tighten. "What kind of clientele?" he asked evenly. Monica waved her hand vaguely. "You know, Professionals, executives, people who attend galas and high-profile events. It's a statement piece. Elliot set the suit down gently on the counter. I see. And what makes you think I don't attend galas or high-profile events? Monica's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't back down. I just assumed, she said with a forced smile. You're not exactly dressed for it. Elliot nodded slowly, taking in her words. Thank you for your time, he said, his tone polite but firm. I'll think about it. He turned to leave, but Monica's voice stopped him. If I may offer a suggestion, she said, her tone suddenly syrupy. We do have a more affordable section toward the back. I think you'll find something there that's more suitable. Elliot didn't reply. He simply walked out of the boutique, his mind already racing. This was exactly the kind of behavior he'd feared, a shallow, dismissive attitude based on appearances. He made a mental note of Monica's name and demeanor before heading to his next destination. As he stepped back into the main hall, Elliot couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. This was his shopping center, his vision brought to life. And yet, it seemed the people he had entrusted to uphold its standards were failing him. He took a deep breath, adjusting the brim of his hat. One bad experience didn't mean the whole day would follow suit, but it was enough to set the tone. Elliot glanced at his watch. It was still early, and there were plenty more stores to visit. He squared his shoulders and set off toward the next location, determined to see this experiment through to the end. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. By the time this day was over, changes would be coming to the Chambers shopping center, whether his employees were ready for them or not. Part 2. The encounter at the Café. Elliot continued his walk through the marble-tiled halls, observing every detail with a quiet intensity. He could feel the weight of judgmental eyes following him. The crimson hat on his head, its bold lettering standing out like a beacon, was clearly a lightning rod for assumptions. But Elliot wasn't there to blend in or make anyone comfortable. He was there to uncover the truth. As he strolled, the enticing aroma of freshly brewed coffee caught his attention. He turned toward Bistro Luxe, a boutique cafe nestled in the heart of the shopping center. The cafe was famed for its gourmet coffee blends and artisanal pastries, drawing a crowd of affluent patrons who enjoyed their lattes in porcelain cups while seated in velvet-lined chairs. Elliot approached the counter where a young barista, Cassie, stood wiping down the espresso machine. She appeared preoccupied, barely glancing up as he stepped closer. Elliot noticed her subtle double-take when her eyes finally caught sight of him. Her gaze flicked to his hat, then quickly away, her body language shifting uncomfortably. "Good morning," Elliot said with a friendly smile. "I'll have a cappuccino and one of those croissants." Cassie hesitated, her hands faltering over the machine. "Sure," she said tersely, not meeting his eyes. She punched the order into the register, her demeanor cold and detached. Elliot handed over a crisp $20 bill, but Cassie's fingers lingered on the counter as if she didn't want to touch his hand. He noticed, of course, but said nothing. Instead, he watched as she turned to prepare his drink, her movements sharp and rushed, as though she couldn't wait to be done with him. As Elliot waited, he couldn't help but overhear a hushed conversation from a nearby table. Two women, dressed in designer outfits, were leaning toward each other, their voices low but audible enough. "Do you see that?" one of them whispered, her gaze darting toward Elliot. "The nerve to walk in here wearing that." The other woman snickered. "Probably thinks he belongs here. Can you imagine?" Elliot's stomach churned. He had anticipated some level of bias or discomfort, but the blatant disdain was still jarring. He remained silent, his focus shifting back to Cassie as she returned with his order. "Here you go," she said flatly, sliding the cup and plate across the counter with little care. The frothy cappuccino nearly spilled over the edge, and the croissant looked like it had been hastily grabbed. "Thank you," Elliot replied, his voice calm but firm. He picked up the items and moved to a nearby table. As he sat down, he noticed Cassie and another barista whispering behind the counter, occasionally glancing in his direction. Their subdued laughter carried just enough to reach his ears. Elliot sipped his coffee, his expression unchanging, though inside, his patience was wearing thin. He had built this shopping center to be a haven of excellence and respect, and yet here he was, being treated as though he didn't belong. He wanted to see how far the disregard would go, so he decided to test the waters further. Rising from his seat, he approached the counter again. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Cassie. "This croissant seems a bit stale. Would it be possible to get a fresh one?" Cassie froze, her smile slipping into a frown. "It's not stale," she said curtly. "We bake them fresh every morning." "I'm sure you do," Elliot said evenly. "But this one doesn't taste quite right. Could you check if there's another batch?" Cassie sighed audibly, glancing at her co-worker for support. "I don't think that's necessary," she replied. "We don't serve bad pastries." Elliot tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I'm not questioning your standards, just asking for a replacement. Is that a problem?" Before Cassie could respond, a third voice cut in. "Is there an issue here?" Elliot turned to see the cafe manager, Victor, stepping out from behind a curtain. Dressed sharply in a tailored vest and tie, Victor carried an air of authority, but his eyes betrayed irritation as he approached. "Not at all," Elliot said calmly. "I simply asked if it was possible to get a fresher croissant." Victor's eyes flicked to Elliot's hat, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, sir, we pride ourselves on the quality of our offerings. If you're not satisfied, perhaps this isn't the place for you." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I leave?" Victor's expression didn't waver. "I'm suggesting that if our service doesn't meet your expectations, there are plenty of other establishments that might." The tension was palpable, and several patrons had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange. Elliot glanced around, noting the curious and judgmental stares. He turned back to Victor, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside. "I see," Elliot said finally. "Thank you for your honesty." He stepped back from the counter, leaving the croissant untouched. As he walked away, he could feel the eyes of the cafe staff and patrons boring into his back. The disdain, the judgment, the blatant dismissal, it all painted a clear picture of what had become of his shopping center. Elliot exited the cafe and leaned against a nearby column, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. His experiment was revealing more than he had expected, and the evidence was undeniable. He wasn't just dealing with isolated incidents of poor service. There was a systemic problem festering within the very heart of his empire. He checked his watch. There was still time left in the day, and plenty more stores to visit. But as he straightened his hat and prepared to move on, Elliot made a silent vow. By the time this day was over, there would be no doubt about who truly belonged at the Chambers Shopping Center, and who didn't. Part 3. The Luxury Boutique. Elliot's steps echoed softly against the polished marble as he approached Atelier Luxe, the shopping center's crown jewel boutique. Renowned for its exclusive designs and clientele, the store boasted a sleek, modern facade, with crystal-clear glass doors and shimmering gold accents. Inside, perfectly arranged racks displayed the latest in high-end fashion, their hefty price tags reflecting the store's commitment to luxury. Elliot adjusted his hat and pushed open the door, the chime of an elegant bell announcing his entrance. A tall sales associate named Amber, dressed impeccably in black with a sharp bob haircut, glanced up from her tablet. Her smile faltered the moment her eyes landed on his hat, and an almost imperceptible shift in her posture betrayed her disapproval. "Welcome to Atelier Luxe," she said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "Can I help you with something?" Elliot's gaze swept over the store. The pristine atmosphere contrasted starkly with the guarded expressions of the staff, who had begun whispering among themselves. "I'm just browsing for now," he replied politely. Amber nodded, though her eyes lingered on him longer than necessary, as if silently willing him to leave. Elliot moved deeper into the store, his fingers lightly brushing the fabrics of the garments on display. He could feel the weight of Amber's presence behind him, her steps echoing his own as she shadowed him through the boutique. "Sir," she said after a moment, her tone firm but carefully measured. "If you're looking for something specific, I'd be happy to direct you. Some of our items are by appointment only." Elliot turned to face her, his expression neutral. "Thank you, but I prefer to browse at my own pace." Amber's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course," she said, though her voice carried a note of skepticism. She stepped back but remained within earshot, her watchful eyes never leaving him. Elliot picked up a tailored blazer, admiring its craftsmanship. "This is excellent work," he said conversationally. "Is it made in-house?" Amber hesitated, her professionalism wavering as she processed the question. "It's part of our limited collection," she replied curtly, her tone suggesting she doubted his ability to afford it. Elliot smiled faintly. "How much?" She paused, visibly weighing whether to answer. "That piece is $6,500, she said finally, her voice laced with condescension. "It's one of our most exclusive items." Elliot nodded thoughtfully and returned the blazer to the rack. "It's a fine piece. I'll keep it in mind." Amber's brows furrowed, and a hint of frustration flashed across her face. "If you're serious about purchasing, we can set up a private fitting room," she said, her tone sharp. "But we don't allow extended browsing. It's company policy." Elliot tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Company policy, you say?" "Yes," Amber replied, her confidence growing. "We strive to maintain a certain atmosphere here at Atelier Luxe." Elliot chuckled softly, the sound carrying a weight that made Amber shift uncomfortably. "And what kind of atmosphere is that, exactly?" Amber opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her carefully curated professionalism beginning to crack. "An exclusive one," she said finally, her voice defensive. "For clients who fit a certain mold," Elliot finished for her, his tone calm but pointed. Amber's face reddened, but before she could reply, a second associate approached, a younger man named Jake, who had been quietly observing from across the store. Unlike Amber, Jake's demeanor was open and genuine. "Sir," Jake said, stepping between Elliot and Amber, "if there's anything you need, I'd be happy to assist." Elliot offered Jake a nod of appreciation. "Thank you," he said simply. Amber shot Jake a glare, but he ignored her, focusing instead on Elliot. "That blazer you were looking at is from our spring line," Jake continued. "It's made from a wool-silk blend and tailored to perfection. Would you like to try it on?" "Not today," Elliot replied, "but I appreciate the offer." Jake smiled warmly, his sincerity standing in stark contrast to Amber's icy demeanor. As Elliot turned to leave, Amber's voice cut through the air once more. "Sir," she called, her tone dripping with forced politeness. "I hope you understand that we have to maintain certain standards. We're not just any store." Elliot stopped in his tracks and turned back to face her. His expression remained composed, but his eyes carried a weight that made Amber hesitate. "Miss," he said evenly, "I understand your standards perfectly. The question is whether you understand mine." Amber's mouth opened in a silent retort, but Elliot had already turned and walked out, leaving behind a room steeped in tension. Jake looked after him with a mix of curiosity and admiration, while Amber stood frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment. Elliot stepped back into the bustling corridor of the shopping center, his thoughts racing. He had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. The culture within his beloved Chambers shopping center had strayed far from his vision. But there were still a few more stops to make before he revealed the truth of who he was and delivered the reckoning that awaited. Part 4. The Jewelry Store Showdown. Elliot adjusted his jacket as he approached the opulent storefront of Elysian Jewels, the crown jewel of the Chambers shopping center. The store's floor-to-ceiling glass windows sparkled with the radiance of diamond-encrusted necklaces, sapphire earrings, and emerald bracelets that beckoned to those who could afford their steep price tags. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man, whom Elliot recognized immediately. Dominic, the senior manager of the store and one of the center's most seasoned staff members. The moment Elliot stepped inside, a gentle chime announced his presence. The subtle hum of an air conditioning vent was the only sound as Dominic looked up, his sharp eyes locking onto the red MAGA hat perched on Elliot's head. The initial warmth in his expression vanished almost instantly. "Welcome to Elysian Jewels," Dominic said coolly, his voice a perfect blend of politeness and indifference. "Is there something I can assist you with?" "I'm looking for a gift," Elliot replied, his tone amiable but firm. He glanced around, feigning interest in the dazzling displays. "Perhaps something for a special occasion." Dominic stepped out from behind the counter, his posture straight and his demeanor restrained. "Our pieces are curated for discerning clientele," he said, gesturing toward a case filled with glittering bracelets. "May I ask what your budget is?" Elliot smiled faintly. "I'll know the right piece when I see it." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course," he replied, though his tone suggested skepticism. He waved to a junior associate, a nervous young woman named Clara. "Clara, assist our guest, will you?" Clara hesitated, clearly picking up on Dominic's underlying disdain. Still, she approached Elliot with a forced smile. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This case here features our latest collection of diamond bracelets. They're crafted with 18-karat gold and start at—" "I'd like to see that one," Elliot interrupted, pointing toward an intricate bracelet nestled at the center of the display. Its diamonds caught the light like fire, radiating brilliance with every angle. Clara blinked, glancing nervously at Dominic. "That piece is part of our private collection," she stammered. "It's quite expensive." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "I didn't ask about the price. I asked to see it." Before Clara could respond, Dominic stepped forward, his demeanor icy. "That bracelet," he said with a thin smile, "is $72,000. We typically reserve it for serious buyers." Elliot's expression didn't waver. "Are you saying I don't look like a serious buyer?" Dominic's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Not at all," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I simply meant that we handle pieces like this with care." Elliot tilted his head, studying Dominic intently. "Care," he repeated. "Interesting. Would that care have anything to do with what I'm wearing?" Dominic stiffened, his professional mask slipping for the briefest of moments. "Not at all," he said quickly, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "We simply have a process." "I see," Elliot replied. He leaned slightly against the counter, his gaze steady. "And does that process involve assuming someone's worth based on a hat?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clara glanced between the two men, her discomfort evident, while Dominic's jaw tightened. "I don't appreciate your tone," Dominic said finally, his voice sharp. "If you're not here to make a purchase, I must ask you to leave. We have other clients to attend to." Elliot chuckled softly, the sound carrying an edge that made Dominic flinch. "So quick to dismiss," Elliot said. "Tell me, Dominic, is this how you treat all your guests? Or just the ones you don't deem worthy of your time?" Dominic opened his mouth to retort, but was interrupted by the sudden chime of the door. A distinguished older woman, draped in pearls and carrying a designer handbag, entered the store. Her eyes swept over the scene, landing briefly on Elliot before shifting to Dominic. "Ah, Mrs. Vance," Dominic said smoothly, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. "Welcome back. It's always a pleasure to see you." Mrs. Vance offered a polite smile, her gaze briefly flicking toward Elliot with mild curiosity. "Thank you, Dominic," she said. "I'm here to pick up my necklace." "Of course," Dominic replied, practically bowing as he turned to retrieve her order. Elliot watched the exchange with quiet amusement, noting the stark contrast in how Dominic treated Mrs. Vance compared to himself. As Dominic handed the woman a velvet box containing an exquisite diamond necklace, Elliot stepped forward once more. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'd like to speak to your regional manager." Dominic turned back to him, his expression incredulous. "Sir, I am the senior manager here. If you have a complaint, you can file it online." "That won't be necessary," Elliot replied, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it up, displaying a contact list with the name Regional Director, Chambers Group, highlighted. He pressed a button, and the phone began to ring. Dominic's confident facade faltered as the realization began to dawn on him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. Elliot smiled, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Let's just say I'm someone who takes customer service very seriously." The phone call connected, and Elliot turned slightly away, speaking in low tones. Dominic watched, his composure crumbling further with each passing second. By the time Elliot ended the call and turned back, Dominic's face had gone pale. "You'll be hearing from the board," Elliot said simply, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "In the meantime, I suggest you reflect on how you represent this establishment." With that, Elliot turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Clara stared after him, her expression a mix of shock and admiration, while Dominic stood frozen, his mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. Elliot stepped back into the shopping center's main corridor, the weight of the encounter settling over him. His experiment had revealed more than he anticipated, and now it was time to act. The Chambers Shopping Center would not remain as it was, not under his watch. The reckoning was coming. Part 5. The Grand Revelation. Elliot walked through the expansive corridors of the Chambers Shopping Center, his footsteps deliberate, echoing with purpose. The glossy tiles and gleaming storefronts reflected a vision of success, but the rot beneath the surface was impossible to ignore. The very empire he had built was failing its core mission, to be a place of inclusion, opportunity, and respect. The day's encounters had laid bare the arrogance and superficial judgments running rampant in his flagship establishment. He paused outside the main atrium, where an ornate stage had been set up for a scheduled mid-afternoon event. A group of executives, store managers, and employees had begun to gather for what they believed was a routine briefing from the shopping center's leadership team. They had no idea what was coming. Taking a deep breath, Elliot adjusted his MAGA hat, smoothed his jacket, and strode toward the stage. As he ascended the steps, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some recognized him from earlier interactions, their eyes widening in confusion or dread. Others whispered about the man in the unassuming red hat, wondering who he could possibly be. Elliot reached the microphone at the center of the stage and tapped it gently, drawing silence from the gathering. His commanding presence, even in his understated attire, demanded attention. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady but firm. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elliot Grant. I am the founder and majority owner of the Chambers Shopping Center." A wave of gasps and shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. Amber, from Atelier Luxe, visibly paled, while Dominic from Elysian Jewels clenched his jaw, his earlier bravado evaporating. Elliot let the revelation settle before continuing. "Today, I walked these halls not as your boss, not as a millionaire investor, but as a regular customer. I wanted to see for myself how the people representing my name treat the guests who walk through these doors. And let me tell you, what I witnessed was unacceptable." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The employees stood frozen, their expressions ranging from guilt to fear. "I saw arrogance. I saw judgment. I saw people being treated as less than because of superficial assumptions," Elliot said, his voice rising slightly. "And in every encounter, I saw the same thing, a lack of respect for the very people who make this shopping center what it is." His gaze swept over the crowd, landing briefly on Amber, then on Dominic. Both avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. In Atelier Luxe, he continued, I was followed and dismissed because of the hat I chose to wear. In Elysian Jewels, I was questioned about my worthiness to view a piece of jewelry, as if the contents of my wallet determined my value as a human being. And throughout this center, I saw a culture that values appearances over authenticity. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking out among them. Elliot raised a hand, silencing them. Let me remind you all of something, he said. This shopping center was built on principles of excellence and equality. It was meant to be a place where anyone, regardless of background, could feel valued. Somewhere along the way, that vision has been lost. Amber stepped forward slightly, as if about to speak, but quickly thought better of it. Dominic stood rigid, his expression a mixture of indignation and fear. Elliot's tone softened, though his words remained resolute. I take responsibility for allowing this culture to fester. As the owner, it's my duty to ensure that every person who enters these doors is treated with respect and dignity. Today, I recommit to that mission. He turned to face the line of store managers standing at the side of the stage, their faces a mix of shock and apprehension. Effective immediately, there will be sweeping changes. We will implement mandatory training for all employees on inclusivity and customer service. Performance evaluations will now include a review of how staff treat every guest, not just the ones they deem worthy. And for those who cannot align with these values, there will be no place for you here. Dominic's face flushed red, his earlier confidence shattered. Amber looked as though she might faint. Clara, who had shown a glimmer of decency earlier, stood a little straighter, her expression one of quiet relief. But I'm not stopping there, Elliot continued, his voice growing more impassioned. This center is more than just a collection of stores. It's a community, and a community thrives when it lifts people up, not tears them down. I will personally oversee these changes to ensure they're carried out with integrity. He stepped back slightly from the microphone, letting the gravity of his words sink in. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Elliot glanced over the crowd once more before delivering his final statement. To those of you who have upheld the values this center was built on, I thank you. To those who have not, consider this your warning. The culture here changes now, and it changes for the better. With that, he stepped away from the podium. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, scattered among the employees who supported his vision. It quickly grew into a resounding ovation as the realization of what Elliot had just set in motion began to resonate. As Elliot descended the stage, Clara approached him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. Mr. Grant, she said softly, thank you for standing up for what's right. Elliot nodded, offering her a small but genuine smile. It's long overdue, he replied. Amber and Dominic lingered near the back of the crowd, their expressions unreadable. Elliot met their gazes briefly before walking past them, his presence a reminder that the era of unchecked arrogance had come to an end. The Chambers Shopping Center had been given a second chance, and Elliot was determined to see it flourish, not as a place of exclusion, but as a beacon of respect and equality. As he exited the atrium, the weight of the day lifted slightly from his shoulders. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long while, Elliot felt hope for the future he was building.